Alexander. Blackwood's blood froze when the waitress serving his coffee whispered those impossible words that shattered 15 years of certainty and revealed the devastating secret his ex-wife had kept since their divorce. Recognition crashed through him like a physical blow as he stared up at Sophia's face, the woman he'd once loved now standing before him in a server's uniform, holding the key to a truth that would completely dismantle his meticulously controlled world. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Alexander Blackwood's world operated with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. His mornings began with black coffee served in bone china, his afternoons filled with meetings where millions hung on his decisions, his evenings concluded with aged whiskey in crystal tumblers. For 15 years, this had been the rhythm of his life. Measured, controlled, predictable, until today. The Verdant, an exclusive restaurant in the financial district, was his regular Tuesday lunch venue. The staff knew him by name. The chef prepared his steak without being asked, and the manager always ensured his preferred corner table awaited. Alexander valued this predictability almost as much as he valued the privacy it afforded him to conduct sensitive business discussions. Mart Blackwood, welcome back, the maître d' greeted with practiced deference. Your usual table is ready. Alexander nodded, barely glancing up from his phone. Another acquisition was nearly complete. Another company folded into his empire. His attorney Mitchell walked beside him, briefcase clutched tightly as if it contained state secrets rather than merger documents. The Harrington deal looks solid, Mitchell said as they settled at the table. Once you sign, we can announce by market close tomorrow. Good. Alexander set his phone face down. And the employee situation? Mitchell's expression tightened. Layoffs will begin next week, around 30% of their workforce. Unavoidable redundancies. 500 lives disrupted. Alexander registered this fact with clinical detachment. He'd long ago learned to separate business decisions from emotional considerations. Sentiment had no place in his world, not anymore. Water for now. Black coffee after, Alexander told the server who approached. He didn't look up until Mitchell's sudden silence registered as unusual. The attorney was staring past Alexander's shoulder, his expression a mixture of recognition and alarm. Alex, he began in a warning tone, but it came too late. Your water, sir, came a voice that struck Alexander like physical force. 15 years evaporated in an instant. He knew that voice, could identify it from a single syllable. It belonged in another life, another world, not here in the carefully controlled environment of the Verdant. Alexander turned slowly. Standing beside their table, dressed in the restaurant's black uniform, was Sophia, his ex-wife. She set the water down with professional precision, her face a neutral mask. Only her eyes, those amber eyes that once looked at him with such warmth, betrayed any emotion, and what he saw there wasn't warmth at all. Would you like to hear our specials today? She asked, her voice steady. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Alexander Blackwood found himself speechless. Sophia looked different. Her once-long chestnut hair now cut in a practical bob, her face thinner, more angular. The years had changed her but not diminished her. If anything, she seemed more formidable now, standing before him with perfect composure while his own had shattered. Sophia, he finally managed. Today's special is pan-seared halibut with a lemon caper sauce, she continued as if he hadn't spoken, as if they were strangers, as if they hadn't once shared everything. It's served with roasted seasonal vegetables. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps we should. The halibut sounds fine, Alexander interrupted, finding his equilibrium. Two could play at this game of pretend. And the coffee. Very good, sir. Sophia made a note on her pad, her wedding ring conspicuously absent. The tan line had long since faded. I'll put your order in right away. She turned to leave, but Alexander couldn't let her walk away, not without understanding. How long have you worked here? He asked, stopping her retreat. Sophia paused, her back still to him. 6 months, she replied without turning. Then she continued toward the kitchen, her posture rigid. You didn't mention your ex-wife worked at your regular restaurant, Mitchell whispered once she was gone. I didn't know, Alexander admitted, watching Sophia disappear through the swinging doors. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental, yet Sophia had seemed genuinely shocked to see him. She's supposed to be in Boston. Well, she's clearly not in Boston. Mitchell glanced around nervously. Look, we should go somewhere else. The Harrington documents are sensitive, and given your history, we're staying, Alexander said with a finality that brooked no argument. He couldn't leave now, not until he understood what Sophia was doing here, so far from where they'd left things. Not until he spoke to her properly. Their divorce had been swift, clinical, like lancing a wound. 15 years ago, when Alexander was still building his empire, when 80-hour workdays were the norm and his ambition outweighed everything else in his life, including their marriage. She's made her choices, I've made mine, Alexander said more to himself than Mitchell. This is just an uncomfortable coincidence. But as he watched Sophia emerge from the kitchen and serve another table, he knew it wasn't that simple. The universe rarely dealt in coincidences this precise. Sophia moved between the tables with practiced ease. There was a quiet dignity in her movement, in the way she smiled at other patrons. Genuine and warm. A smile he once took for granted. She was good at this work, he realized, though it was so far removed from her former life as the wife of a rising financial star. Quote, her master's degree and her plans for an art gallery. Their coffee arrived, delivered by a different server, a young man who seemed oblivious to the tension simmering at table 7. Alexander barely acknowledged him, his attention fixed on Sophia as she worked across the room. "Alex, focus," Mitchell urged, pushing a document toward him. "We need to review these terms before." "Give me a minute," Alexander said, standing abruptly. Mitchell sighed. This is exactly why mixing business and personal matters is a terrible idea. Alexander ignored him, moving with purpose toward the far corner where Sophia was entering an order on a computer terminal. She sensed his approach, her shoulders tensing before she turned to face him. "Is there a problem with your order, sir?" Her voice was professional, distant. "Why are you here, Sophia?" he asked quietly. "I'm working," she replied, her fingers continuing to tap the screen. "And you're interfering with that. You know what I mean? Why this restaurant? Why my restaurant?" Sophia finally looked at him directly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal a flash of anger. "Your restaurant? I wasn't aware you owned the Verdant. You know what I mean?" Alexander repeated, lowering his voice as a nearby diner glanced their way. "Of all the restaurants in this city, you happen to work at the one I visit every week? Contrary to what you've always believed, Alexander, the world doesn't revolve around you." She finished entering her order and stepped away from the terminal. "I needed a job. They were hiring. The pay is decent and the tips are excellent. That's all. You were running your own gallery in Boston." Something flickered in her eyes, pain, perhaps, or regret. "Things change. Sophia, your halibut will be out shortly." She cut him off, moving past him. "Please return to your table." Alexander watched her walk away, frustration building. This wasn't how their first meeting in 15 years was supposed to go. Though if he were honest with himself, he'd never envisioned any reunion at all. Their marriage had ended, the assets divided, the papers signed. They'd moved on to separate lives, or so he'd thought. He returned to find Mitchell sorting documents with pointed emphasis. "Are we ready to work now?" the attorney asked. "Something's wrong," Alexander said, ignoring the sarcasm. "Sophia wouldn't be here unless something happened. Maybe she just needed a change of scenery," Mitchell suggested without looking up. "People do move cities, change careers. Not Sophia. Not like this." Alexander knew her, or at least he once had. The woman who'd left him had been fiercely independent, determined to build something of her own. Her gallery was successful. She was featured in art news. Mitchell sighed, setting down his pen. "Alex, whatever happened in her life since your divorce, it's not your concern anymore. That was the point of the divorce." Perhaps that was true for most people, but Alexander and Sophia's separation had been complicated by more than just the usual division of assets. There had been the accident just months before they split, the accident that changed everything. Sophia returned with their meals, setting the plates down with professional efficiency. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, addressing the question to Mitchell rather than Alexander. "We're fine, thank you," Mitchell replied when it became clear Alexander wouldn't. She nodded and turned to leave, but Alexander caught her wrist gently, barely a touch. "Sophia, please, 5 minutes. After my lunch." For a moment he thought she would refuse. Then she gave a barely perceptible nod. "My break is at 2:30 in the park across the street." It was more than he'd expect. "Thank you." She slipped away and Alexander turned his attention to the meal before him, though he tasted nothing. His mind was too full of questions, of memories both bitter and sweet. "You're making a mistake," Mitchell warned, watching him closely. "Whatever happened between you two, reopening old wounds won't help either of you." Perhaps not. But Alexander had built his fortune by addressing problems directly, not by avoiding them. And seeing Sophia here now felt like a problem demanding resolution, or at least understanding. The rest of lunch passed in a blur of documents and discussions that failed to capture his full attention. Alexander signed where indicated, agreed to terms he'd normally scrutinize, his mind elsewhere. At 2:25 he stood. "We're done here," he told Mitchell. "Send the final versions to my office." Mitchell gathered the documents with a disapproving frown. "Don't forget you have the board call at 3. I won't be late." Alexander left cash for the bill, far more than necessary, and headed for the exit, checking his watch. He had never been one to wait for anyone, but today he found himself on a park bench 5 minutes early, watching the restaurant entrance across the street. At exactly 2:30, Sophia emerged, removing her server's apron and placing it in her bag. She crossed the street with purpose, her face unreadable. Alexander stood as she approached, suddenly uncertain of the proper greeting for a woman who had once been his wife, his best friend, his greatest regret. She solved the problem by sitting without offering her hand or any other gesture of familiarity. 5 minutes, she reminded him. Alexander sat beside her, close but not touching. "The gallery failed?" he asked, dispensing with pleasantries. Sophia's laugh was short, bitter. "Always direct, aren't you?" "No, Alexander, the gallery didn't fail. I sold it. At a profit, actually." "Then why are you waiting table?" She turned to look at him fully, her eyes challenging. "Why do you care?" It was a fair question, one he wasn't sure he could answer. Why did he care what had become of the woman who'd left him, who'd signed away any claim to his growing fortune, who'd disappeared from his life so completely? Before he could formulate a response, Sophia sighed, her expression softening slightly. "I'm not just waiting tables. I'm rebuilding, starting over. In the same city as me? That seems... I didn't know you still ate at the Verdant," she interrupted. "When I moved back 3 months ago, I took the first decent job I found. The restaurant's location is convenient for my other work." "Other work?" A small, secretive smile played at her lips. "I teach art at the community center on Westbrook Avenue, 3 evenings a week." Alexander tried to reconcile this information with the Sophia he'd known, ambitious, destined for gallery openings and artistic prominence. "That's different from your plans." "Yes," she agreed simply. "It is. She checked her watch. Your 5 minutes are almost up and you still haven't asked whatever it is you really want to know. Alexander studied Sophia's face, searching for traces of the woman he'd married. She was still beautiful, perhaps more so now, with the composure that came from weathering life's storms. The spark in her eyes remained, though tempered by something he couldn't quite name. Why'd you come back to this city? He finally asked. Sophia tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar it made his chest tight. My mother's health is declining. Alzheimer's. She needs me close. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Eleanor had been kind to him, even after the divorce. Is she at Pinecrest? No, I couldn't afford that. Her tone was matter-of-fact, not accusatory. She's at Meadowbrook. It's adequate. The implication hung between them. Once, cost would have been no object. Once, she'd had access to his fortune. She'd walked away from it all, refusing even the generous settlement he'd offered. Sophia, if you need financial assistance, I don't. She cut him off firmly. I'm managing. That's not why I agreed to talk to you. Alexander nodded, respecting her pride even as he calculated the cost of transferring Eleanor to the best memory care facility in the state. He would make the arrangements anonymously. Sophia didn't need to know. You still haven't asked your real question, she prompted. He hesitated, suddenly unsure what his real question was. Why are you waiting tables? Why did you sell your gallery? Why did you leave me? Why did everything fall apart? Are you happy? He asked finally. Sophia's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise flickering across her face. Of all the questions he might have asked, this clearly wasn't the one she'd expect. Sometimes she answered after a moment's consideration. My life is ... Quieter now, simpler, there's a certain peace in that. She turned to face him direct. Are you happy? Alexander almost laughed. What a strange concept to apply to his existence. I'm successful. The company is stronger than ever. We just acquired Harrington Technologies. That's not what I asked. Of course it wasn't. Sophia had always been able to see through his deflections, to separate the man from his achievements. It was one of the things he'd loved about her, until it became inconvenient. Happiness isn't a metric I track, he admitted. Some things never change, she murmured, a hint of sadness in her voice. She glanced at her watch again. I need to get back. Wait, Alexander said, unwilling to let her go so soon. Have dinner with me tonight. A proper conversation. That's not a good idea. Why not? Because we've said all that needs saying, Alexander. 15 years ago. He shook his head. Clearly we haven't, or you wouldn't be back here working at my regular restaurant. That's just coincidence. But she wouldn't meet his eyes when she said it. I don't believe in coincidence, Alexander replied. Neither do you. Sophia stood, smoothing her uniform skirt. One dinner, that's all. I finish at 8. I'll send a car. I can make my own way, she countered, that familiar stubborn streak emerging. Text me the address. You still have the same number? A small smile played at her lips. You never deleted it, did you? Alexander didn't answer, but they both knew the truth. In 15 years, through 3 phones and countless contacts, he'd never been able to delete her number. Just as he'd never removed her name from the list of approved visitors at his building. Never changed the security code she'd helped choose. Never replaced the painting she'd hung in his study. The last one she'd completed before the accident. 8:30 then, he said. The address will be in your messages. With a nod, she turned and walked back toward the restaurant. Her 5 minutes expired. Alexander watched her go, struck by the strange sensation that he was watching 2 Sophias simultaneously, the one walking away now, and the one who had walked away 15 years ago, both heading in directions he couldn't follow. His phone buzzed, breaking the spell, Mitchell reminding him of the board call. Alexander turned toward his office building, his mind already shifting back to acquisitions and quarterly projections. But beneath the surface, a current of anticipation ran through him. 8:30 couldn't come soon enough. The rest of Sophia's shift passed in a blur of orders and polite small talk. Her encounter with Alexander had left her more shaken than she cared to admit. Seeing him again, those piercing blue eyes, that focused intensity had brought everything rushing back. The love, the loss, the reasons she'd had to leave. You okay? Martina, the head server, asked as they restocked napkins. You seem distracted. Fine, Sophia replied automatically. Just tired. Was it that guy? The one who pulled you aside? He's a regular, right? Big tipper. An old acquaintance, Sophia said, the understatement of the decade. Nothing important, but it was important, and they both knew it. Alexander Blackwood had once been the center of her universe, the man she'd planned to grow old with. Now he was just another wealthy patron who ordered black coffee and left excessive tips. Except that wasn't true either. He'd never been just anything. As she finished her closing duties, Sophia tried to talk herself out of the dinner. It was a mistake, reopening old wounds. They had made their choices long ago. The paths they'd chosen had diverged for good reasons. Yet when 8 o'clock came, she found herself in the employee bathroom applying lipstick and fixing her hair. She'd brought a change of clothes, a simple black dress she used for gallery openings at the community center. Nothing fancy, but a step up from her waitress uniform. Hot date? Martina teased, catching her in the act. Just dinner, Sophia replied, though her racing heart suggested otherwise. Outside, she checked her phone. The address Alexander had sent was for Lumiere, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. Of course it was. Alexander had always believed in making statements through his choice of venue. She considered canceling, then hailed a cab instead. One dinner. She could survive one dinner. And perhaps then they could both move forward. finally closing the door on what might have been. Lumiere occupied the top floor of the Archer building, its glass walls offering panoramic views of the city. The Materdi escorted her to a private dining room where Alexander waited, standing as she entered. He'd changed as well, his business suit replaced by a charcoal cashmere sweater that softened his sharp edges. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you." She took the offered seat, noting that he'd remembered her preference for facing the windows rather than having her back to them. "This is excessive. I wanted privacy." Alexander gestured to the empty dining room. No interruptions. A server appeared with champagne, pouring 2 glasses before disappearing as silently as he'd come. "You always did know how to set a stage," Sophia observed, taking a small sip. The champagne was exquisite, of course. Everything in Alexander's world was. "Is that what I'm doing? Setting a stage, aren't you? The private room, the vintage champagne, Single quotes, she set down her glass. "What is this really about, Alexander?" He considered her question, taking his time as he always did when something mattered. Alexander never rushed important decisions or conversation. It was one of his strengths in business, if occasionally maddening in personal matters. "Closure, perhaps," he said finally. "Or curiosity. About the path not taken?" His gaze was direct, unfiltered. "Don't tell me you haven't wondered, Sophia. What might have been if things had been different?" She had. Of course she had. Quiet moments in the small hours of the night, in every gallery opening without him by her side, and every achievement with no one to share it with. "Wondering doesn't change what happened," she said quietly. "No," he agreed, "but understanding might." Before she could respond, the server returned with their first course, an artful arrangement of delicacies that normally would have delighted her. Tonight she barely noticed them. "You mentioned rebuilding," Alexander said when they were alone again. "What happened to the gallery in Boston?" This was safer territory, facts rather than feelings. "I sold it 3 years ago. The neighborhood was gentrifying, property values skyrocketing. The offer was too good to refuse." "Smart move," he nodded approvingly, "but why not open another gallery?" Sophia took another sip of champagne, buying time. How much to reveal? How much did she owe him? "The accident," she said finally. "It changed things for me too, Alexander. Not just for you." His expression tightened, the old pain visibly resurfacing. "The accident, their private apocalypse, the event that had divided their lives into before and after. The panic attacks came back," she continued, surprising herself with her candor. "Being in enclosed spaces, crowds, it became too much. Running a gallery means openings, events, being on all the time. I couldn't do it anymore." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "That's why you're teaching instead. Smaller groups, controlled environment." Yes, she hadn't expected him to grasp it so quickly. Perhaps he had changed over the years. "The community center is perfect. Intimate classes, students who are there because they truly want to learn. No pressure to sell, no schmoozing with investors." "You always were the better artist," Alexander said unexpectedly. "I was just good at selling things." The compliment caught her off guard. During their marriage, Alexander had supported her artistic ambitions financially but had never shown much interest in her actual work. His focus had been on building his empire, on proving himself to a father who was never satisfied. "You kept the painting," she said, remembering his earlier slip. "In your study," he nodded. "It's the last thing you created before ... call quotes. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, before the accident, before the hospital stays, and before the miscarriage that took their child and any chance of children. Before their marriage crumbled under the weight of grief neither of them knew how to carry." "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. "It reminds me," he said simply. "Of what? That there was more to life than quarterly reports?" Once. The admission hung between them, unexpectedly vulnerable from a man who had built walls around his heart long before she'd met him, walls that had only grown higher after they'd lost the baby. Their main courses arrived, giving them both a moment to collect themselves. Sophia used the interruption to study Alexander more carefully. There was more silver at his temples now, more lines around his eyes. He carried himself with the same confidence, but there was a weariness to him she didn't remember, a heaviness that went beyond physical fatigue. "You're not sleeping well," she observed when they were alone again. Alexander's eyebrows rose. "How can you tell? I married you for 7 years, Alexander. I know what you look like when you're running on determination instead of rest." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The Harrington acquisition has been ... challenging." "That's not it," she countered, the old familiarity between them resurfacing. "You thrive on challenges. It's something else." He set down his fork, meeting her gaze directly. "Why did you really come back, Sophia?" The truth this time, the question she'd been dreading yet knew was inevitable. Sophia took a deep breath, weighing her options. She could deflect again, maintain the story about her mother's health, which was true, but not complete. Or she could tell him everything, including the real reason she'd sought employment at the Verdant. The moment hung between them like crystal. Delicate, transparent, potentially sharp-edged. Sophia traced the rim of her wine glass with her finger, buying time as she considered her response. "My mother's health isn't a lie," she began carefully. "She does need me, but it's not the whole truth," Alexander pressed, recognizing her equivocation. He'd always been able to sense when she was holding something back. Sophia met his gaze directly. "No, it's not." The server appeared again, offering dessert. Alexander waved him away with a subtle gesture, never taking his eyes off Sophia. In the 15 years since their divorce, he had negotiated billion-dollar deals. face-down corporate raiders, and restructured failing companies. None of those moments had left him feeling as unsettled as he felt now, waiting for his ex-wife's revelation. "I'm sick, Alexander." 3 words delivered with such quiet dignity that at first he didn't process their meaning. When he did, the blood drained from his face. "How sick?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Stage 3 breast cancer, diagnosed 14 months ago." Alexander's mind raced, calculating timelines. "But your gallery sale was 3 years ago. You said I said the offer was too good to refuse." That was true. Sophia's smile was sad, knowing. "I didn't say it was the only reason. Why didn't you reach out?" The question escaped before he could consider it, revealing more vulnerability than he'd intended. "Would you have wanted me to?" She tilted her head slightly. After how we left things, Alexander remembered their last conversation in the lawyer's office. The coldness between them, the careful distance they'd maintained as they dismantled their life together. They had been strangers by then. 2 people hollowed out by grief, unable to recognize each other through its distorting lens. "Yes," he said finally, surprising himself with his certainty. "I would have wanted to know." Sophia's expression softened. "I considered it. When I first got the diagnosis, your name was on my call list, but then I thought, what good would it do? We'd made our choices. What's the prognosis?" Alexander asked, shifting into problem-solving mode, his default approach to crisis. "Good, actually. I responded well to treatment. The latest scans show significant reduction. My oncologist is optimistic." Relief washed through him, followed immediately by confusion. "Then why come back now? Why not stay in Boston with your medical team?" Sophia hesitated, and he saw her weighing her words carefully. This was it, the real reason. The thing she was still holding back. "The treatments were expensive," she admitted, "even with insurance. The gallery sale covered most of it, but Boston's cost of living ... single quotes." She shook her head. "Coming back made financial sense. My mother's apartment has a spare room. The local cancer center is excellent. And there's the community-centered job. Flexible hours, understanding management." Alexander's eyes narrowed. She was still dancing around something. And the verdant? Was that financial necessity too? A flash of something? Guilt, perhaps, crossed her face. "Initially, yes. The pay is good. The hours work with my treatment schedule." "Initially," he repeated, catching the qualifier. "And after initially?" Sophia took a deep breath. "I heard you still ate lunch there every Tuesday." "Regular as clockwork." The admission hung between them. Alexander sat back, processing its implications. "You wanted to see me." "I wanted you to see me," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Why?" The question was simple, but the answer clearly wasn't. Sophia seemed to be struggling with herself, weighing how much to reveal. "Because I needed to know if you'd changed," she said finally. "If the man who walks into the verdant now is the same man I left 15 years ago." "And what's your verdict so far?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the sudden tightness in his chest. "The jury's still out." Her smile was tentative but genuine. "You didn't recognize me at first." That was ... illuminated. "You've changed your hair," he said defensively. "I've changed more than that." He couldn't argue with that. The Sophia before him now had an edge that his wife had lacked, a hard-won resilience born of battles he hadn't been part of. "Why did you need to know if I'd changed?" he asked, circling back to the heart of the matter. "Why does it matter to you after all this time?" Sophia's gaze dropped to her hands, folded neatly on the tablecloth. Her wedding ring had been gone for 15 years. But he could still see the phantom impression of it in the way she unconsciously touched her left ring finger with her thumb. "Because I have something to tell you," she said, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear her. "Something I should have told you years ago." Alexander's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Shook her head. "Not here. Not yet." Her eyes met his again, and there was fear in them now, but also determination. "I need to be sure first." "Sure of what?" Frustration edged his voice. He had built his life around certainties, around clear data points and definitive actions. Sophia's cryptic approach was maddening. "Sure that you can handle it," she replied simply. "That it won't just be another thing you bury in work and acquisitions and 18-hour days." The accusation stung precisely because it contained truth. After the accident, after they lost the baby, he had retreated into work, into the one area of his life where he still felt in control. He had left Sophia to navigate her grief alone, too consumed by his own to see what it was doing to her. "I'm not that man anymore," he said, though even to his own ears the claim sounded hollow, unproven. "Aren't you?" Sophia's gaze flicked meaningfully to his phone, which had vibrated with messages at least a dozen times during their dinner. "When was the last time you took a real vacation, or spent a Sunday without checking your email, or put someone else's needs before the company's?" Each question was a direct hit. Alexander couldn't remember the last time he'd done any of those things. His life was his work. They had become indistinguishable years ago. "That's not fair," he countered. "I've built something significant, something that employs thousands, that I'm not questioning your success," Sophia interrupted gently, "or even your choices. They were yours to make. I'm just asking if they've made you happy." It was the second time she'd asked that question, and he still didn't have it. Success, achievement, respect, these were the metrics he understood. Happiness had always seemed like a luxury, something to be deferred until some undefined future when he'd accomplished enough to deserve it. "What is it you need to tell me, Sophia?" he asked. Instead of answering her question, she studied him for a long moment, moment, then seemed to come to a decision. I'll be back at the Verdant next Tuesday. If you still want to know, come for lunch. Same time. A week? You want me to wait a week? I've waited 15 years, she said, rising from her seat. 7 more days won't kill me. Alexander stood as well, frustration warring with a respect for her boundaries he hadn't felt in their marriage. At least let me drive you home. I'll take a cab, she said, but without the defensiveness from earlier. Thank you for dinner, Alexander. It was, clarifying, was it? Nothing felt clear to him. If anything, the evening had left him with more questions than answers. Yes, she said, and there was something in her expression, a certainty, a peace, that I'll see you Tuesday, or I won't. She left him standing in the private dining room, her departure as enigmatic as her presence in his life had always been. Alexander sank back into his chair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Sophia was back. She was sick, or had been. She had deliberately sought out his regular restaurant, put herself in his path, and she had something to tell him. Something significant enough that she needed to be sure he could handle. His mind raced through possibilities. Financial trouble beyond what she'd admitted? A reconciliation attempt? News about a mutual friend from their past? Nothing seemed to warrant this level of mystery, this careful evaluation of his worthiness to receive the information. One thing was clear. Sophia still had the power to append his carefully ordered existence. Just a few hours in her presence had left him questioning choices he'd thought settled years ago. His phone vibrated again. Mitchell, undoubtedly, with some urgent update on the Harrington acquisition. For the first time in years, Alexander let it go to voicemail. Instead, he signaled for another drink and turned to look out at the city below, the lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Somewhere out there, Sophia was heading home, to her mother's apartment, to a life so different from the one they'd planned together. A life shaped by illness, by financial constraints, by choices neither of them could have foreseen when they'd stood before their friends and fam promising forever. The week ahead suddenly stretched before him like an eternity. 7 days of wondering, of second-guessing, of anticipation. 7 days to prove to himself as much as to Sophia that he had indeed changed, that he wasn't the same man who had let grief consume him, who had retreated into work rather than face the devastation of their loss. 7 days to decide if he was ready to hear whatever truth she had been carrying all these years. His drink arrived, but Alexander barely noticed it. His mind was already on Tuesday, already sitting at his regular table at the Verdant, already watching the door for Sophia's arrival. Whatever she had to tell him, he realized he needed to hear it. Perhaps had needed to hear it for 15 years without knowing what was missing. For the first time since their divorce, Alexander Blackwood felt the stirrings of something other than ambition or achievement or the cold satisfaction of a deal well struck. It took him a moment to identify the unfamiliar sensation. Hope. It was hope. The week crawled by with excruciating slowness. Alexander threw himself into work with even greater intensity than usual, as if the additional hours could somehow accelerate time itself. The Harrington acquisition closed successfully. The stock price jumped. The board was pleased. None of it registered with the satisfaction he normally felt. His thoughts kept returning to Sophia, to the tension in her voice when she'd said, "I have something to tell you," to the fear in her eyes, to the careful way she was evaluating him, measuring his worthiness to receive whatever truth she'd been carrying all these years. On Friday, Mitchell cornered him after a particularly distracted meeting. "Whatever's going on with you and your ex-wife, fix it," the attorney said bluntly. "You just agreed to a contractual amendment that could cost us millions without even reading it." Alexander frowned. "What amendment?" "Exactly my point." Mitchell dropped a folder on his desk. "I've flagged it. Fix it before close of business." Alexander stared at the folder, the gravity of his lapse sinking in. He'd never made this kind of mistake, not even as a junior analyst fresh out of business school. Sophia's reappearance wasn't just an emotional disruption, it was becoming a liability. "I'll handle it," he promised. "Good." Mitchell paused at the door. "And Alex, whatever she wants from you, money, connections, whatever, just give it to her and move on. This distraction isn't worth what it's costing." The suggestion should have made sense. It was exactly what Alexander would have advised anyone else in his position. Identify the price point, make the payment, close the chapter, clean, efficient, final. But the idea of reducing whatever was between him and Sophia to a transaction felt not just wrong, but impossible. Whatever she needed to tell him, it wasn't something that could be resolved with a check. The weekend offered no relief. His penthouse, usually a sanctuary of minimalist order, felt cavernous and empty. He found himself staring at the painting in his study, Sophia's last work before the accident. It depicted a storm-tossed sea at dawn, the horizon line barely visible through layers of gray and gold. He had always interpreted it as hopeful, a reminder that light eventually breaks through even the darkest clouds. Now he wondered if he'd been seeing what he wanted to see all along. By Sunday night, Alexander had made a decision. Whatever Sophia needed to tell him, he would hear it without judgment, without retreat, without trying to fix or control the outcome. For once in his life, he would simply listen. Monday was endless, each hour stretching into the next with painful deliberation. He canceled his afternoon meetings, went home early, and did something he hadn't done in years. Nothing. He sat on his balcony with a glass of scotch, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded him of Sophia's paint. Tuesday morning found him awake before dawn, his body humming with an anticipation he couldn't suppress. He dressed with unusual care, a charcoal suit, no tie. His appearance professional but less formal than his usual boardroom attire. At 11:30, a full hour before his regular lunch reservation, he was in his car, directing his driver toward the Verdant. "Sir?" the driver asked, clearly confused by the change in routine. Alexander normally went straight from his morning meetings to the restaurant. "Just drive around for a while, James," he instructed. "I'm early." The car circled the block several times before Alexander finally directed James to drop him off. It was 11:55 when he walked through the Verdant's doors, his heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. The maître d' greeted him with the usual deference. "Mr. Blackwood, your table is ready." Alexander scanned the restaurant, searching for Sophia, but didn't see her among the servers preparing for the lunch rush. "Is Sophia working today?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The maître d' hesitated. "Miss Hollet called in this morning. She won't be in today." Alexander felt the words like a physical blow. She wasn't coming. After all the anticipation, all the self-reflection, all the careful preparation, she had simply not shown up. "Is she ill?" he asked, concern overriding disappointment. "I'm not at liberty to discuss our employees' personal matters." "Mr. Blackwood," the maître d' replied with practiced discretion. "Would you still like your table?" Alexander considered leaving. The restaurant suddenly unbearable and Sophia's absent, but some instinct kept him there. The same instinct that had preserved her phone number all these years. "Yes," he decided. "My usual table, please." He was shown to his corner spot, where Mitchell was already waiting, spreadsheets laid out with military precision. "You're late," Mitchell observed without looking up. "That never happens." Alexander didn't bother explaining. He took his seat, automatically reaching for the menu he never used, needing something to occupy his hands. "The Westbrook acquisition looks promising," Mitchell began, sliding a document toward him. "Their technology would integrate well with Harrington's." "Not today," Alexander interrupted, still scanning the restaurant, still hoping Sophia might appear. Mitchell sighed, setting down his pen. "This is about her, isn't it? Your ex-wife. She has a name," Alexander said with unexpected sharpness. "Sophia, then. Is this about Sophia?" Alexander nodded, offering no further explanation. Mitchell had been his attorney for 20 years, but there were boundaries to their relationship. Lines neither man crossed. Personal matters remained personal. Their usual server approached, not Sophia, but a young man named David who had worked at the Verdant for years. "The usual, Mr. Blackwood?" David asked. "Just coffee today," Alexander replied. "Black," Mitchell ordered as well, then waited until they were alone before speaking again. "Whatever's happening with Sophia, it's affecting your judgment. The board has noticed." Alexander met his gaze directly. "My personal life is not the board's concern. It is when it impacts the company," Mitchell countered. "You've been distracted, making uncharacteristic mistakes. If this continues, it won't." Alexander cut him off. "After today, it will be resolved one way or another." David returned with their coffee. As he set Alexander's cup down, he slipped a folded note beside it. His movement so subtle it would have been easy to miss if Alexander hadn't been watching for something. Anything from Sophia. "From M's. Hole," David murmured discreetly. "She asked me to give you this." Alexander's hand closed around the note, relief washing through him. Mitchell, observing the exchange, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Excuse me," Alexander said, rising to the table. He needed privacy for whatever message Sophia had sent. In the quiet hallway leading to the restrooms, he unfolded the note. Sophia's handwriting was as familiar as his own heartbeat, though he hadn't seen it in 15 years. "Alexander, I'm sorry for the change in plan. My doctor scheduled an unexpected follow-up today. Nothing serious, just routine monitoring. If you still want to hear what I have to tell you, come to the community center on Westbrook 7. My class ends at 6:30. I'll be in Studio B. S. Alexander." Read the note twice, processing the information. She hadn't backed out. She had simply changed the venue from the public space of the restaurant to the more private setting of her classroom. It was a significant shift, suggesting whatever she needed to say required more intimacy than a lunch conversation would allow. He returned to the table where Mitchell was reviewing documents with pointed concentration. "I need to leave early today," Alexander announced, no longer concerned with how his behavior might appear to the board or anyone else. "We haven't even discussed the Westbrook numbers," Mitchell protested. "Tomorrow," Alexander said with finality. He placed several bills on the table, more than enough to cover their barely touched coffees. "I have somewhere I need to be tonight." Mitchell's expression was a mixture of concern and resignation. "This isn't like you, Alex." "No," Alexander agreed, tucking Sophia's note into his pocket. "It isn't." He spent the rest of the afternoon in uncharacteristic distraction, watching the clock with an intensity that had his assistant checking it for malfunction. At 5:30, he dismissed his team, ignoring their surprised expressions. Alexander Blackwood leaving the office before 8 p.m. was unprecedented. The community center on Westbrook Avenue was a restored Victorian building in a transitioning neighborhood, not quite gentrified but no longer struggling. Its brick facade was softened by window boxes filled with late summer blooms, and warm light spilled from its arched windows into the gathering dusk. Alexander arrived at 6:15, too restless to wait any longer. He found a bench across the street and watched as people entered and exited, mostly adults of various ages, some carrying art portfolios or instrument cases. This was a different world from the corporate towers where he spent his days, a world where success was measured in creative expression rather than profit margins. At 6:40, he crossed the street and entered the building. A hand-lettered directory pointed him towards Studio B on the second floor. As he climbed the worn wooden stairs, Alexander was struck by a memory. Sophia in their first apartment, painting at an easel by the window. Her hair caught up in a messy bun, her face alight with concentration. Before the corporate success, before the penthouse, before the accident, when they had been young and in love, and certain the world would unfold exactly as they planned. The door to Studio B was partially open. Through the gap, Alexander could see Sophia moving around the space, straightening easels, collecting brushes. She was dressed simply. Jean, a loose cotton blouse, flat shoes. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the clean lines of her profile. She looked utterly at home in the humble studio, more herself than she had in either the Verdant's uniform or the black dress she'd worn to dinner. He knocked gently on the doorframe. Sophia looked up, her momentary surprise quickly replaced by a calm acknowledgement. "You came," she said simply. "You asked me to," he replied, stepping into the studio. The space smelled of paint and turpentine, familiar scents that transported him back to their early years together. "How was your appointment?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "Fine, just routine blood work." She gestured to the room. "This is where I teach. 3 evenings a week plus a children's class on Saturdays." Alexander looked around, taking in the student works in various stages of completion. Landscapes, still lifes, abstract compositions, all showing different levels of skill but equal enthusiasm. "They're good," he observed. "They're learning," Sophia corrected, but with pride rather than criticism. "That's what matters." She moved to a cabinet, removing 2 mugs and a thermos. "Coffee, it's not the Verdant's, but it's decent, please." She poured 2 cups, handing him one. The normalcy of the gesture belied the tension crackling between them, the unspoken words, the years of separation, the secret she was finally ready to share. "Thank you for coming here," Sophia said, perching on the edge of a table. It felt like the right place for this conversation. Alexander remained standing, unwilling to commit even to sitting until he understood what was happening. "Why here?" Sophia's eyes met his, steady and clear. "Because this is my life now. The real one. Not the waitress uniform, not the gallery owner I used to be. This." She gestured to the studio around them. "Teaching, creating small things, building something meaningful one student at a time." Alexander nodded, understanding dawning. She wanted him to see her as she truly was now, not as the woman he'd married or the server who had surprised him at the Verdant. "It suits you," he said honestly. A small smile touched her lips. "Yes, it does." She took a breath, setting down her coffee. "Alexander, do you remember our last conversation before the divorce? In the lawyer's office?" he asked, confused. That sterile meeting had been all legal terminology and signatures, hardly a conversation at all. "No," she said softly. "The night before. In the hospital." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. The night before the divorce. The hospital. The memory he'd buried so deeply he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge its existence. "I remember," he said, his voice rough with sudden emotion. Of course he remembered. It'd been the lowest point in his life, worse than the accident itself, than the miscarriage, worse than signing the divorce papers the next day. It was the moment he had truly lost Sophia, though neither of them had recognized it at the time. She had been back in the hospital for what they had hoped would be the final surgery, a procedure to repair internal damage from the accident that had taken their unborn child 3 months earlier. The physical recovery had been slow, complicated by infections and complications that seemed endless. The emotional recovery had been non-existent. Alexander had been consumed by work, burying himself in acquisitions and expansions, staying at the office until midnight, returning before dawn. When he did visit Sophia in the hospital, he brought his laptop, taking calls in the hallway while she slept. He told himself he was being supportive in the only way he knew, by ensuring their financial security, by building something that would make all the pain worthwhile somehow. The night before the divorce, he had arrived at the hospital to find Sophia sitting up in bed, staring out the window with empty eyes. The conversation that followed had been brief, devastating, and in his memory, final. "You want to talk about that night?" he asked now, setting down his coffee mug with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. "We need to," Sophia replied quietly. "We never really did, you know. Not properly." She was right. The next day, they had met with their attorneys, signed the papers, and walked away from 7 years of marriage with clinical efficiency. No tears, no recriminations, just the hollow completion of what had begun in that hospital. "What is there to say after 15 years? Alexander asked. Not defensively, but with genuine uncertainty. Sophia took a deep breath. "Do you remember what I asked you that night?" He did. The question had haunted him, though he'd never admitted it to anyone. "You asked if I still wanted children," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years of silence. "If I was planning to start over with someone else, have the family we'd lost." Sophia nodded, her expression somber. "And what did you tell me?" "I said no," Alexander replied, the memory crystallizing with painful clarity. I couldn't imagine going through that again with anyone. That the company would be my legacy. "That's what I thought you said." Sophia's voice was soft but steady, but I wasn't sure if I'd dreamed it. I was on so many medications then. Alexander moved to one of the student chairs, suddenly needing to sit. The conversation was dragging him back to a place he'd spent 15 years trying to escape, the dark months after the accident, when grief had transformed him into someone he barely recognized, someone whose only lifeline to sanity was the cold, predictable world of business. "Why does it matter now, Sophia?" "What I said then. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to a small closet at the back of the studio, unlocked it, and removed a portfolio case. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if what she was about to share required this careful preparation. After the accident, she began setting the portfolio on a table. When we found out I couldn't have more children, I felt ... erased, like my future had been stolen. Not just our baby, but all the children we might have had. Alexander nodded. He had felt it too. The yawning emptiness where their future family should have been. It had been easier to focus on what he could control, what he could build, than to face that void. The night before the divorce, Sophia continued, I wasn't just asking about your plans. I was trying to tell you something, but you were so certain, so definitive in your answer that I couldn't find the words. A cold feeling spread through Alexander's chest. Tell me what? Sophia's fingers traced the edges of the portfolio without opening it. When the accident happened, I was 10 weeks pregnant. I know, Alexander said. Confusion mingling with the old grief. We lost the baby. The doctor said a lot of things during those months, Sophia interrupted gently, some of which got lost in translation between specialists, some of which changed as new information emerged. Alexander stared at her, a terrible suspicion beginning to form. What are you saying, Sophia? She opened the portfolio at last, removing a single photograph. For a moment she held it against her chest, her eyes closed as if gathering courage. Then she turned it around. The photo showed Sophia, clearly much thinner and paler than she was now, sitting in a wheelchair. On her lap was a tiny bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket. Only a small face was visible, eyes closed in sleep, impossibly delicate features framed by wisps of dark hair. Our daughter Sophia said simply, Lily, born 6 months after the accident, 3 months premature but otherwise healthy. A miracle, the doctors called her. Alexander couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt around him, the familiar sensation of a panic attack threatening at the edges of his consciousness. He forced himself to focus on the photograph, on the tiny face that combined his features with Sophia's in a perfect alchemy of genetics. We didn't lose the baby, he managed finally, his voice barely audible. She survived, yes. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. I tried to tell you that night in the hospital. I had just found out myself. One specialist finally connected the dots. What they'd thought was internal bleeding was actually the placenta, still intact, still supporting our daughter despite everything. They warned me the pregnancy was high risk, that I might still lose her, that carrying to term could endanger my own recovery. Alexander's mind raced, trying to process what she was saying, what it meant. But why didn't you? He stopped, the answer already forming in his consciousness. Because of what I said, Sophia nodded. You were so certain, so final. The company will be my legacy, you said. I realized in that moment that we wanted different things, that the accident had changed us both in ways that couldn't be reconciled. So you let me go, Alexander said, the full weight of her decision 15 years ago finally becoming clear. You signed the divorce papers without telling me I was going to be a father. I gave you what you said you wanted, Sophia corrected, her voice gentle but firm, freedom from the possibility of that pain. And I protected our daughter from a father who might resent her existence, who might see her as a burden on his carefully constructed life. The accusation cut deep, precisely because Alexander couldn't be certain it was wrong. The man he had been 15 years ago, hollow with grief and obsessed with control, would that man have been capable of embracing the terrifying vulnerability of fatherhood, especially with a premature infant, a child who might face ongoing health challenges? You had no right to make that decision alone, he said, anger finally breaking a shock. Perhaps not, Sophia acknowledged, surprising him with her candor. It's a choice I've questioned every day since, but I did what I thought was right at the time with the information I had, which was that you wanted no part of fatherhood, that you've chosen a different path. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing the small studio as emotions crashed through him, rage, grief, confusion, betrayal. 15 years. His daughter was 15 years old, had lived an entire life without him. While he had been building an empire he'd convinced himself was enough. Where is she now? He demanded. Is she here? In the city? Sophia nodded. She's with my mother this evening. She doesn't know about you yet. Not the full story. She knows her father wasn't in the picture, that it was complicated. I've never spoken ill of you to her. How generous, Alexander said bitterly, then immediately regretted the sarcasm. This wasn't about him and Sophia anymore. There was a child, note, a teenager, caught between their past mistakes. I want to meet her, he said, his voice softening but no less determined. Today. Now. Sophia shook her head. Not like this, Alexander. Not with you reeling from shock and anger. She deserves better than that for a first meeting. She deserved better than 15 years without a father. He shot back, then forced himself to take a deep breath. Sophia was right. Rushing into a meeting now, emotions raw and unprocessed, would be selfish. This wasn't about easing his guilt or validating his anger. It was about a teenage girl whose world was about to change. Tell me about her, he said instead, his voice steadier. Everything. What she's like, what she loves, what she hates. I want to know my daughter. The tension in Sophia's shoulders eased slightly at his change in approach. She reached into the portfolio again, removing more photographs, a series of images that documented the life he'd missed. Lily as a toddler, grinning with 2 teeth. Lily at perhaps 5, painting at an easel, her face scrunched in concentration. Lily in a school uniform, proudly holding a science fair ribbon. Lily more recently a teenager with his eyes and Sophia's smile, looking at the camera with a confidence he recognized from his own adolescent photos. She's brilliant, Sophia began, her voice softening with maternal pride. pride. Skipped a grade in math. Loves science and art equally. She says they're just different languages for understanding the world. She has your analytical mind and my creativity. Your stubbornness too. The single quotes despite everything. Alexander felt a smile tugging at his lips. Poor kid. She plays cello, Sophia continued. Started when she was 6 and never wanted to stop. She has competitions, recitals. She's talking about Juilliard, though that's a few years away still. Each detail was a gift and a dagger simultaneously. Precious glimpses of the person his daughter had become. Painful reminders of all he had missed. First steps, first words, first days of school. The everyday miracles of watching a child grow. Is she healthy? He asked, the question that had been lurking beneath all others. After everything, the accident, the premature birth, she's perfect, Sophia assured him. Some respiratory issues when she was very young, but she outgrew them. Annual checkups with specialists just to be safe. But she's thrived, Alexander. She's strong, like both of us. Alexander sank back into the chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd learned. He had a daughter. A living, breathing, cello-playing, math-loving daughter. The child he'd believed lost in the accident had been growing up just a few hours away all these years. Why now? He asked finally, looking up at Sophia. After 15 years, why come back into my life now? Sophia's expression grew somber again. Because of the cancer diagnosis. You said your prognosis was good, Alexander said, alarm cutting through his emotional tumult. It is, she assured him quickly, but facing mortality has a way of clarifying one's priorities. I realized that if something did happen to me, Lily would be left with no knowledge of her father beyond the sanitized version I've shared with her. She deserves more than that. You both do. The weight of her words settled between them. Sophia had carried this secret for 15 years, had raised their daughter alone, had built a life separate from the one they'd planned together. Now she was offering him a chance to be part of that life, not out of need or desperation, but out of a recognition that some bonds transcend even the most painful separations. I need time, Alexander said finally, to process this, to figure out how to be a father to a teenage daughter I've never met. Sophia nodded, understanding in her eyes. Take whatever time you need. But Alexander, her voice took on an edge of gentle warning. Don't take too long. She's 15. In a few years, she'll be making her own decisions about college, about her future. If you want to be part of that future, the time to start is soon. Alexander stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring out at the city without seeing it. In his hand was a tumbler of scotch, untouched. On the table behind him lay the photograph Sophia had given him, a carefully curated timeline of his daughter's life, 15 years compressed into a dozen images. Lily, her name was Lily. He had a daughter named Lily who played the cello and excelled at math and wanted to attend Juilliard. A daughter who had his eyes and Sophia's smile and, according to her mother, his stubborn streak. A daughter who had no idea he existed, at least not as anything more than an abstract concept, a shadowy figure from her mother's past. Alexander set down the glass and picked up the most recent photograph. Lily, at what must have been 14, sitting on a park bench with a book in her lap, looking up at the camera with an expression that combined curiosity and amusement. There was something in her posture and the tilt of her head that reminded him powerfully of his own mother. His phone rang. Mitchell again, undoubtedly with questions about tomorrow's board meeting. Alexander ignored it. For the first time in his adult life, business seemed not just secondary but utterly insignificant compared to the personal earthquake he was experiencing. After leaving Sophia's studio, he had driven aimlessly for hours, his mind racing with questions, accusations, regrets. By the time he'd returned to his penthouse, emotional exhaustion had replaced the initial shock, leaving him in a strange liminal state. Aware of the magnitude of what he'd learned, but unable to fully process it. He had a daughter. For 15 years, he had mourned a child who was very much alive, who had been growing and learning and becoming a person just a few hours away in Boston. The thought was both miraculous and devastating. Alexander placed the photograph carefully back with the others and reached for his phone, not to return Mitchell's call, but to do something he hadn't done in years. Research that had nothing to do with business. He typed how to meet your teenage child for the first time into the search bar. The results were sparse and largely unhelpful, focused on reunions after divorce or adoption rather than his unique situation. One article about estranged parents reconnecting with adult children suggested a neutral location, clear boundaries, and managed expectations. It was a start, at least. His phone rang again. This time it was a number he recognized all too well, though it hadn't appeared on his screen in 15 years. Sophia. Hello, he answered, his voice more tentative than he'd intended. I wanted to check on you, Sophia said without preamble. You've left the studio in quite a state. Alexander almost laughed at the understatement. That's one way to put it. Are you all right? The question was surprisingly gentle, given the circumstances. He had every right to be furious with her, to demand explanations, to threaten legal action. Yet here she was, calling to check on his well-being. No, he admitted honestly. I don't think all right is on the menu for a while, I understand. There was a pause, the sound of her moving somewhere quieter. Just wanted to make sure you got home safely. The way you left, I was concerned. I drove around for a while, Alexander said. Needed to clear my head. It didn't work. Another pause, longer this time. Do you have questions? I imagine you must have hundreds, thousands, he corrected, running a hand through his hair. But I'm not sure I can formulate any of them coherently right now. When you're ready. Then, Alexander moved back to the window, looking out at the city he had helped shape, the skyline dotted with buildings that bore his company's influence. None of it seemed to matter in the face of what he'd lost, or rather, what he'd never known he had. Does she look like me? He asked suddenly. In person, I mean. More than just in photographs, yes, Sophia said, a smile evident in her voice, especially when she's concentrating on something difficult. She gets this little furrow between her eyebrows, just like you do when you're reviewing contracts. Alexander's throat tightened. It was such a small thing, such a specific detail, yet it made Lily suddenly more real than all the photographs combined. And her health is truly good? He pressed. No lasting effects from the accident or the premature birth? She was in the NICU for almost 2 months, Sophia recalled, her voice softening at the memory. There were some scary moments, but she's a fighter, Alexander, Roy's husband. The doctors say her lungs show no signs of the prematurity now. She runs cross-country for her school team. Pride swelled in his chest, an emotion so unexpected and powerful it left him momentarily speechless. Pride in a child he'd never met, never held, never known. Yet the feeling was undeniably real. I want to meet her, he said again, more resolved than before. I know, Sophia replied. And you will, but we need to do this carefully, Alexander, for her sake. What have you told her about me? The question had been gnawing at him since he'd learned of Lily's existence. Sophia took a deep breath, the sound audible through the phone. I told her that her father was someone I loved very much, but that we were separated by circumstances neither of us could control, that he didn't know about her, and that was my choice, not his rejection. It was more generous than he'd expected. A narrative that absolved him of abandonment without revealing the full complexity of their separation. As she got older, Sophia continued. She asked more specific questions. I've told her you're successful in business, that you're intelligent and determined, that she inherited her mathematical abilities from you, but not my name, Alexander noted without accusation. No, Sophia confirmed. Not yet. I needed to see you first to understand if you'd changed, to gauge whether bringing you into her life would help or harm her. And what's your verdict? He asked, echoing her words from their dinner at Lumiere. I think you're still figuring that out yourself, she replied diplomatically, but I also think you deserve the chance to try. And more importantly, she deserves to know the truth about where she comes. Alexander closed his eyes, gratitude washing through him despite everything. Sophia could have kept this secret forever. She could have moved across the country, changed their names, ensured he never learned of Lily's existence. Instead, she had deliberately placed herself in his path. Thank you, he said simply. Don't thank me, Sophia responded, her voice suddenly tight. I'm not sure I did the right thing 15 years ago. I'm not even sure I'm doing the right thing now. I'm just trying to fix a mistake before it's too late. The admission was startling in its vulnerability, a glimpse of the uncertainty Sophia herself must have lived with all these years. When? Alexander asked. When can I meet her? She has a cello recital this Saturday, Sophia said after a moment's hesitation. It's at the Westbrook Community Center. In the evening, she's playing Batch's cello suite, No. 1. Perhaps you could come, not to meet her yet, but to see her, to start the process. The suggestion was unexpectedly perfect, an opportunity to observe his daughter in her element, without the pressure of an introduction, to begin bridging the 15-year gap with the safety of distance. I'll be there, Alexander promised. What time? 7 o'clock. But Alexander, Sophia's tone grew cautious. You'll need to stay anonymous for now. I haven't prepared her yet. This needs to be gradual. I understand, he said, though, the idea of sitting in an audience, watching his daughter perform without being able to acknowledge her, to congratulate her, to tell her how proud he was, created a peculiar ache in his chest. I should go, Sophia said. Lily will be wondering where I am, but Alexander ... Take care of yourself. This is a lot to process. After they hung up, Alexander returned to the photographs, studying each one with renewed attention. In the earliest images, Lily was barely recognizable as the teenager she would become, just a tiny, fragile newborn connected to monitors in what was clearly a NICU. In the later ones, her personality emerged more distinctly, serious in some, laughing in others, always with that spark of intelligence in her eyes. His daughter, the miracle who had survived against all odds, the child he had mourned without knowing she lived. Alexander set the photos aside and picked up his phone again, opening his calendar. With a few taps, he cleared his schedule for the next 2 weeks, ignoring the notifications from Mitchell and his executive team that immediately followed. For the first time in 15 years, perhaps for the first time ever, Alexander Blackwood was putting something ahead of the company. He had a cello recital to attend. The following days passed in a blur of research and preparation. Alexander read everything he could find about teenage development, about father-daughter relationships, about reconnecting with estranged children. He consulted with a family therapist, speaking in hypotheticals to protect Lily's privacy, seeking guidance on how to approach this unprecedented situation. By Friday, his executive team was in barely contained panic. Alexander had missed 3 board meetings, canceled 2 investor calls, and delegated critical decisions to his CFO without explanation. Mitchell had left 17 voicemails, each more urgent than the last. Whatever's happening, the final message began, it needs to stop. The board is questioning your commitment. Rumors are starting. Your absence is being interpreted as a lack of confidence in the Harrington integration. Fix this, Alex. Now, for the first time in his career, Alexander did not respond to a direct message from Mitchell. Instead, he focused on selecting an appropriate suit for tomorrow's recital. Conservative, but not intimidating. Professional, but not cold. He settled on a charcoal gray with a blue tie that Sophia had once said matched his eyes. Whether she would remember or care about such a detail after 15 years was doubtful, but it felt important somehow. Saturday morning, Alexander woke before dawn, his body humming with anticipation and anxiety. In 12 hours, he would see his daughter in person for the first time. Not as a photograph, not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing person with her mother's smile and his stubborn streak. The weight of what he had missed. 15 birthdays, first steps, first words, school plays, scrapped knees, bedtime stories threatened to overwhelm him if he dwelled on it too long. Instead, he forced himself to focus on the future, on the relationship they might build if he approached this correctly. One step at a time, beginning with tonight's recital. Just watching, observing, beginning to know her from a distance. The rest would follow, if he was patient, if he was careful, if he was worthy of the second chance he'd been granted. The Westbrook Community Center was transformed for the evening recital. The usual fluorescent lighting had been dimmed, replaced by softer lamps that cast a warm glow over the modest performance space. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, a small stage set up at the front with a single spotlight. Alexander arrived 20 minutes early, choosing a seat near the back where he could observe without being noticed. He felt strangely nervous, more so than before multi-million-dollar negotiations or board presentations. His palms were damp, his heart racing. The charcoal suit that had seemed appropriate that morning now felt like armor, setting him apart from the casually dressed parents and family members filing in. The program in his hand listed the performers, 12 students of varying ages, each playing a classical selection. Lily Hollet was 7th on the list, performing Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 in G major, Prelude. Alexander traced her name with his finger, still marveling at its reality. Lily Hollet, his daughter. He scanned the growing audience, spotting Sophia near the front, speaking with an elderly woman who must be her mother, Eleanor. They were saving a seat, presumably for Lily after her performance. Alexander watched as Sophia laughed at something her mother said, struck by how at ease she seemed in this environment. So different from the tense woman he'd encountered at the Verdun, even at dinner. The lights dimmed further, and a middle-aged woman stepped onto the stage. The instructor, based on her brief welcome speech. Alexander barely registered her words. His attention focused on the side entrance where the performers would emerge. The first students were young, elementary and middle school age, their performances enthusiastic, if occasionally faltering. The audience applauded encouragingly after each piece. Alexander found himself growing increasingly tense as Lily's turn approached, his fingers gripping the program so tightly the paper crumpled. Then suddenly she was there. A slender girl with dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, wearing a navy blue dress, walked confidently to center stage, carrying a cello that seemed both too large and perfectly proportioned for her frame. Alexander's breath caught. The photographs hadn't prepared him for the living reality of his daughter. She settled onto the chair, adjusted her instrument, and looked out at the audience with calm focus. Even from a distance, Alexander could see his own eyes looking out from her face, the same shape, the same intense blue. But her smile as she acknowledged the audience was pure Sophia, warm and genuine. When she began to play, Alexander forgot to breathe. The Bach prelude unfurled from her fingers and bow with a maturity that belied her 15 years. There was technical precision, yes, the notes clear and accurate, but more than that, there was interpretation, emotional depth, narrative quality that transformed the well-known piece into something personal. Alexander had attended symphony performances in the finest concert halls around the world, heard virtuosos play on priceless instruments, but nothing had ever moved him like watching this teenage girl, his daughter, communicate through music. Each note seemed to bridge the 15-year gap between them, telling him everything he had missed, everything she had become without him. When she finished, the audience erupted into applause. Alexander found himself on his feet without consciously deciding to stand, his hands coming together in soundless applause as tears blurred his vision. At the front of the audience, Sophia and Eleanor were standing as well, pride evident in their posture. Lily bowed, her smile widening at the response, then carefully took her cello and left the stage. Alexander remained standing a moment longer than the rest of the audience, unable to tear his gaze from the spot where she had been, as if he could imprint the image of her permanently in his mind. The remaining performances passed in a blur. Alexander barely registered the other students, his thoughts consumed with Lily. She had talent, real talent, not just the biased assessment of proud parents. The way she handled the instrument, her musicality, her presence, these weren't qualities that could be taught. They were innate, a gift she had somehow inherited or developed entirely on her own. When the recital ended, the audience dispersed into the lobby for a small reception. Alexander hung back, watching as students reunited with their families, accepting congratulations and criticism in equal measure. He spotted Lily immediately, standing with Sophia and Eleanor, her cello case now strapped to her back. She was taller than her mother, he noted with surprise, though she had the same delicate build. Keeping his promise to Sophia, Alexander maintained his distance, observing from the periphery of the gathering. Lily was animated as she spoke with what appeared to be friends, other performers from the recital. She gesticulated with her hands the same way he did when explaining complex concepts. The realization sent another jolt of recognition through him. She's remarkable, isn't she? The voice beside him belonged to Sophia, who had somehow approached without his noticing. She stood a few feet away, her gaze following his to where Lily was now helping a younger student adjust the position of her violin. Beyond remarkable, Alexander agreed, his voice rough with emotion. I don't have words, Sophia, I know. Sophia's smile was understanding. I felt the same way the first time I heard her play. She was 7, just starting lessons. Even then, there was something special about how she approached me. Thank you, Alexander said, suddenly turning to face her fully. For letting me see her. Single quotes. Sophia nodded, her expression soft. It seemed like the right first step. When can I meet her? The question had been building since the moment Lily walked on stage. The need to know his daughter no longer abstract but visceral and immediate. Soon, Sophia promised. I'm going to talk to her tomorrow. Tell her about you, that you're here and want to meet her. How do you think she'd react? Alexander couldn't help but ask, fear suddenly mingling with anticipation. Sophia considered the question carefully. She's been curious about you her whole life. I think she'll be... cautiously excited. But Alexander, her voice took on a warning note. This isn't a business deal. You can't approach this with timelines and performance metrics. Lily will need time to adjust to get to know you gradually. This has to be on her terms. I understand, he said, and meant it. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Alexander was prepared to follow someone else's lead, to relinquish control of the process entirely. I should get back, Sophia said, glancing toward Lily, who was now looking around the room curiously. She'll wonder where I went. I told her I was getting punch. Alexander nodded, reluctantly returning his attention to his daughter. She has your smile, he observed. When she finished playing, that was your smile. And your focus, Sophia replied. That intensity when she performs? Pure Alexander Blackwood. There was no bitterness in her tone, just a simple acknowledgement of shared genetics. It gave Alexander hope that perhaps despite everything, they might find a way to co-parent this remarkable young woman they had created. I'll call you tomorrow after I've spoken with her, Sophia promised, already moving away. And Alexander, thank you for coming, for caring. She disappeared back into the crowd, returning to Lily's side with 2 cups of punch. Alexander watched as his daughter accepted the drink, her expression brightening as she described something to her mother and grandmother, her free hand moving expressively. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, her gaze swept across the room and landed on him. There was no recognition in her eyes, of course, just the casual observation of a stranger at her recital. But Alexander felt the connection like a physical force, an invisible thread linking him to this child he'd only just discovered. He waited until Lily, Sophia, and Eleanor had left before making his own exit, unwilling to risk an unplanned encounter. In the car, he sat silently for several minutes, replaying every moment of the recital in his mind, committing to memory the way Lily had held the bow, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows apparently inherited from him, the graceful bow after her performance. His phone buzzed with yet another message from Mitchell, this one more dire than the last. Emergency board meeting called for Monday morning. Topic: leadership stability. This is serious, Alex. They're questioning your capacity to lead. Call me immediately. For the first time in his career, a potential corporate crisis failed to trigger Alexander's instinctive response. The company that had been his singular focus for 15 years suddenly seemed distant, almost irrelevant compared to what he'd witnessed tonight. His daughter played the cello. She had his eyes and Sophia's smile. She helped younger students and stood tall when she performed. These facts felt infinitely more significant than stock prices or board confidence. Alexander started the car but didn't immediately drive home. Instead, he found himself heading toward the office, not out of workaholic habit, but with a new purpose forming in his mind. If he was going to be a father to Lily, a real father, present and involved, certain changes were inevitable. Better to face them head-on than to let circumstances dictate the outcome. The office building was nearly empty at this hour on a Saturday. Alexander took the private elevator to the executive floor, his footsteps echoing in the deserted hallway as he made his way to his office. The space had always felt like a second home, more familiar in many ways than his penthouse. Tonight it felt like a museum, a carefully preserved artifact from a previous life. He sat at his desk and began to write. Not emails or memos, but a plan. A restructuring more significant than any corporate reorganization he'd ever overseen. The restructuring of his own life to make room for his daughter. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. A perfect autumn day that found Sophia and Lily in their usual spot, the small garden behind Eleanor's apartment building. It was their ritual, these Sunday breakfasts when weather permitted. A time for connection before the week began. Lily was still riding the high of last night's successful performance, recounting details of the recital that Sophia had witnessed firsthand but enjoyed hearing through her daughter's perspective. Eleanor had excused herself to rest, leaving mother and daughter alone with cooling cups of tea and the conversation Sophia had been rehearsing since. Alexander had walked out of her studio days ago. Your batch was exceptional, Sophia said, watching her daughter's face light up at the praise. Ms. Abernathy mentioned several people asked about you afterward. Really? Lily straightened, a strand of dark hair falling across her face. She tucked it behind her ear, the same gesture Alexander had always used when concentrating. Like who? The opening Sophia had been waiting for presented itself with perfect timing. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Actually, there was someone special in the audience last night, she began, her voice carefully neutral. Someone who's been wanting to meet you for a long time. Lily's expression shifted from curious to cautious, the intuition she'd inherited from both parents immediately sensing the weight of the moment. Who? She asked, setting down her teacup. Your father. Two simple words that altered the reality between them instantly. Lily went very still, her blue eyes, so like Alexander's, widening with shock. My father, she repeated slowly. But you said he didn't know about me. He didn't, Sophia confirmed. Not until recently. Lily's brow furrowed, processing this new information. You told him? Why now? After 15 years, there was no accusation in her tone, only genuine confusion, and the first stirrings of something that might have been hope or fear or both. Because of the cancer diagnosis, Sophia replied honestly. It made me reconsider certain choices I'd made, including keeping you two apart. So he knows I exist now, Lily said carefully. And he was at my recital? Sophia nodded. He was. He stayed in the back, respected my wish not to approach you yet. I wanted to prepare you first to make sure you were ready. What's he like? The question burst from Lily with sudden intensity, as if she'd been holding it back her entire life, which Sophia realized she probably had. He's says that's a single quote. Sophia paused, searching for words that would be truthful without prejudicing Lily either for or against the father she'd never known. Brilliant, determined, successful in business. You have his analytical mind, his focus, and his eyes, Lily added quietly. You've always said that. Yes, Sophia smiled. His eyes exactly. Lily was silent for a moment, looking down at her hands. Pianist's hands, though she'd chosen the cello instead. Finally, she looked up, vulnerability and courage warring in her expression. Does he want to meet me? For real, I mean, not just watching from the back of a recital hall. Yes, Sophia said without hesitation. Very much. He's overwhelmed with the knowledge of your existence, Lily, in a good way. He's trying to process 15 years of absence, trying to understand how to be a father. But why didn't you tell him? The question Sophia had been dreading, though she'd known it was inevitable. You always said circumstances separated you, but you never said what circumstances. Sophia had prepared for this, had promised herself she would be honest without burdening her daughter with the full weight of adult mistakes and misunderstandings. After the accident, she began carefully. When we thought we'd lost you, your father and I were both broken. We grieved differently. He retreated into work. I retreated into myself. By the time I learned you had survived, that you were still growing inside me, we had already begun divorce proceedings. And you didn't tell him then? Lily pressed, not unkindly, but with the directness she'd inherited from Alexander. When you found out I was alive. I tried, Sophia admitted. The night before our divorce was finalized, I went to tell him. But our conversation went in a direction that made me believe he wasn't ready to be a father, that he had chosen a different path. I made the decision I thought was best at the time. Was it? Lily asked, the question startlingly mature. The best decision? Sophia reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. I don't know, sweetheart. I've asked myself that question every day for 15 years. I protected you from potential rejection or indifference, but I also denied you a father who might have overcome his grief, who might have been wonderful. Lily nodded, absorbing this with the thoughtfulness that had always characterized her, even as a small child. What's his name? Never told me, Alexander Blackwood. Recognition flickered in Lily's eyes. The businessman? Pierce Holdings? Sophia nodded, surprised. You know of him? We did a case study on his company in economics last semester, Lily explained. The teacher said he's revolutionized how corporate acquisitions work. She paused, processing this new connection. My father is Alexander Blackwood. She said it not as a question but as a statement, testing the reality of it on her tongue. Sophia watched as her daughter's quick mind made connection, filled in gaps, reconstructed her own history with this new information. He wants to meet as soon as you're ready, Sophia said after giving Lily a moment to absorb the revelation. But there's no rush. This should happen on your terms when you feel prepared. Lily looked up, a new determination settling over her features. I want to meet him today. The decisiveness was pure Alexander. Sophia hesitated, concerned the timeline might be too accelerated, that Lily needed more time to process. Lily, are you sure? This is a lot to take in. I've had 15 years of wondering, her daughter replied simply. I don't want to wait anymore. While Sophia was having breakfast with their daughter, Alexander was sitting across from Mitchell in his office, the emergency Sunday meeting, unexpected but not unwelcome. It gave him the opportunity to implement the changes he'd outlined the night before. The board is calling for a vote of no confidence, Mitchell was saying, his usual composure fractured by genuine alarm. Your absence, the delegated decisions. The missed meeting. It's created a perception of disengagement that's threatening every bill. I'm not disengaged, Alexander replied calmly. I'm reprioritizing. Mitchell stared at him as if he'd started speaking in tongues. Reprioritizing what? Exactly. My life. Alexander slid a folder across the desk. Effective immediately, I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations. Janet Stein will assume the role of acting CEO while I transition to executive chairman. Mitchell's jaw literally dropped. Can't be serious. The Harrington integration is at a critical phase. The Westbrook acquisition is being finalized. This is exactly the wrong time to— There will never be a right time, Alexander interrupted. That's the nature of business. There's always another deal, another crisis, another opportunity that can't be missed. What's happened? Mitchell demanded, question more bewildered than accusatory. This isn't like you, Alex. First the distraction with your ex-wife, now this abrupt leadership change. If you're having some kind of ... episode, there are better ways to handle it than torpedoing your company. Alexander smiled, recognizing that a week ago he would have had the same reaction to anyone suggesting he'd step back from the company he'd built. It would have seemed like madness, like surrender, like failure. Now it felt like the only rational choice. I'm not having an episode, he assured Mitchell. I'm having a revelation. I recently learned something that's changed my perspective on ... everything. And what exactly could be so important that you'd risk everything you've built? Alexander hesitated, then made a decision. Mitchell had been more than his attorney for 2 decades. He was the closest thing Alexander had to a friend. He deserved the truth. I have a daughter, he said simply, 15 years old, with Sophia. Mitchell's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally dawning comprehension. The baby? From before the divorce? But I thought, so did I, Alexander said. So did everyone. But she survived. Sophia only found out after our marriage was effectively over. She made a choice not to tell me based on who I was then. He met Mitchell's gaze directly, and she wasn't wrong about who I was. So this, stepping back, it's for her? Your daughter? Her name is Lily, Alexander said, feeling a surge of pride at speaking her name aloud to someone else for the first time. And yes, it's for her. But it's also for me. I've spent 15 years building a company at the expense of everything else. I don't want to wake up 15 years from now with nothing but stock certificates and board approvals to show for my life. Mitchell was silent for a long moment, studying Alexander with new eyes. I've never seen you like this, he said finally, his tone softer. It's ... actually not terrible. Alexander laughed, surprised by the unexpected support. High praise coming from you. The board won't like it, Mitchell warned, ever the pragmatist. The stock might take a hit initially, Alexander replied with a shrug. The fundamentals are solid. Janet is more than capable, and I'll still be involved. Just not at the expense of getting to know my daughter. As if summoned by the mention of her, Alexander's phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. Lily knows. She wants to meet today. Are you ready? Alexander felt his heart rate accelerate, a mixture of anticipation and terror washing through him. Was he ready? Could anyone be truly ready for a moment like this? Yes, he typed back. Name the time and place. The response came almost immediately. The community center garden, 2 p.m., just you, me, and Lily. The community center garden was small but meticulously maintained, with winding brick paths and wooden benches nestled among flowering shrubs and ornamental trees. On this autumn Sunday, dappled sunlight filtered through red and gold leaves, creating patterns on the ground that shifted with each gentle breeze. Alexander arrived 15 minutes early, unable to sit still in his apartment any longer. He had changed clothes 3 times, eventually settling on dark jeans and a navy cashmere sweater. Respectable but not intimidating, approachable rather than formal. He'd brought nothing with him, having considered and rejected a dozen potential gifts as too presumptuous, too desperate, or too impersonal for this first meeting. He chose a bench near the center of the garden where he would be easily visible. His hands, usually steady in the most high-pressure negotiations, trembled slightly as he checked his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. In his entire life, he had never been so nervous, so utterly terrified of making a mistake. What did one say to a child they were meeting for the first time? What could possibly bridge 15 years of absence, even unintentional absence? At precisely 2 o'clock, movement at the garden entrance caught his attention. Sophia appeared first, her expression a mixture of apprehension and determination. Beside her, slightly taller but with the same graceful posture, was Lily. Alexander stood, his heart hammering against his ribs. Seeing his daughter in this context, knowing who she was, knowing she was coming specifically to meet him, was entirely different from observing her at the recital. She was wearing jeans and a burgundy sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders rather than pulled back as it had been during her performance. She looked simultaneously younger and older, a child on the cusp of adulthood, her eyes scanning the garden until they landed on him. Those eyes, his eyes, registered recognition, curiosity, and a wariness that cut him to the quick even as he acknowledged its complete justification. They approached slowly, Sophia's hand resting lightly on Lily's back in a gesture of support. Alexander remained rooted to the spot, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment. Lily, Sophia said when they reached him, her voice gentle but steady. This is Alexander Blackwood, your father. The formal introduction, necessary as it was, highlighted the absurdity of their situation, a father and daughter, bound by blood and genetics, requiring an introduction like strangers. Hello, Lily, Alexander said, his voice rougher than he'd intended, emotion scraping his throat raw. She replied, her gaze direct and assessing in a way that reminded him powerfully of himself. There was none of the emotional overflow he'd felt since learning of her existence, just careful observation, taking his measure before committing to anything. An awkward silence descended, heavy with 15 years of absence and 1,000 unasked questions. Why don't we sit? Sophia suggested, gesturing to the bench Alexander had just vacated. They arranged themselves with Lily in the middle, a physical manifestation of her central position in this strange, new family configuration. Alexander was acutely aware of the few inches of space between himself and his daughter, a distance that seemed both infinitesimal and unbridgeable. Mom told me about the accident, Lily said abruptly, startling both adults with her directness. That you thought I died before I was born. Alexander nodded, grateful for her straightforwardness despite the painful subject. Yes, the doctors told us, They told us we'd lost you. It was the worst day of my life. He hadn't planned to be so immediately honest, but something about Lily's direct gaze made artifice impossible. She deserved nothing less than complete truth from him, even when that truth was uncomfortable. But you didn't know I survived, she continued, her tone making it half statement, half question. No, Alexander confirmed. I only learned about you a week ago when your mother and I reconnected. Lily turned to Sophia. And you didn't tell him because ... Sophia took a deep breath. Because I made a mistake, Lily. I thought I was protecting both of you, but I was wrong. She looked at Alexander over their daughter's head. We were both still healing from the accident. Decisions were made from places of pain rather than clarity. Lily absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. So what happens now? She asked, addressing neither parent specifically. Are you going to be in my life? Or is this just a one-time meeting? The bluntness of the question caught Alexander off guard, though it shouldn't have. At 15, Lily had lived her entire life without a father. She had no reason to expect permanence from him, no foundation of trust to build upon. I want to be in your life, he said with absolute conviction. If you'll let me. I've already started rearranging my professional responsibilities to make that possible. Lily's eyebrows rose slightly. You're changing your job for me? Mom says you're, super important at your company will survive without my constant attention, Alexander said, surprising himself with how easily he dismissed what had once been his sole focus. Getting to know you is more important. Why? The question was simple but profound. You don't even know me. Because you're my daughter, Alexander replied, the words still new and wondrous on his tongue. Because I've missed 15 years of your life and I don't want to miss any more if I can help it. Lily studied him, searching his face as if looking for evidence of insincerity. What if I'm not what you expected? What if we don't get along? Her vulnerability was suddenly apparent beneath the direct question, the fear of rejection that no child should have to carry. Alexander felt his heart constrict with the realization that despite Sophia's best efforts, Lily had grown up with a void where his presence should have been. A void that had shaped her in ways he was only beginning to understand. Lily, he said gently, I have no expectations except the privilege of getting to know you. You don't have to be anything in particular for me. You just have to be yourself. A small smile, the first he'd seen directed at him, briefly touched her lips. That's what Mom always says. Well, your mother is very wise, Alexander acknowledged, catching Sophia's surprised glance. It took me a long time to learn that lesson. I heard you at my recital last night, Lily said, changing subjects with the adaptability of youth. Mom pointed out where you were sitting afterward. You were extraordinary, Alexander said, the pride he'd felt surging anew. The batch was... I've never heard it played with such emotion. Lily's smile widened slightly, pleasure at the genuine compliment evident. Thanks. I've been working on it for months. Miss Abernathy says I need to focus more on the technical precision in the middle section, but the emotion is good. Both are important, Alexander agreed, delighted by this glimpse into her musical life. But the emotion is what makes people listen. That's what I said. Lily's animation increased, her reserve momentarily forgotten. Technique without feeling is just ... mechanical. The conversation flowed more easily after that, Lily's passion for music creating a bridge between. She told him about her first cello teacher, about the competitions she'd won and lost, about her dream of studying at Juilliard. But I also like math, she admitted, and physics, so I'm not sure if music will be my career or just something I do because I love it. You have time to figure that out, Alexander assured her. And whatever you choose, I'll support you. Lily's expression grew serious. Even if it's not business? Mom said you're really into business. Alexander laughed, the sound surprising all three of them. Yes. I am really into business, as you put it, but that doesn't mean you have to be. I want you to find your own path, Lily. My friend Madison's parents make her take all these business classes and leadership seminars, Lily confided. They have her whole life planned out. It seems exhausting. It would be, Alexander agreed, thinking of his own childhood. His father's relentless expectations, the path that had been predetermined for him before he could walk. I'd rather help you explore your interests than impose mine, Sophia, who had been quietly observing their interaction, smiled at this unexpected perspective from her ex-husband. Your father has changed quite a bit, it seems, she observed. People can change, Alexander said, meeting her gaze with an intensity that acknowledged their shared past and the mistakes made by both when they have sufficient motivation. The conversation continued, easier now that the initial ice had been broken. Lily asked questions about Alexander's childhood, his work, his interests outside of business, a category he ruefully admitted was underdeveloped. He answered everything truthfully, editing only for age appropriateness, never for image management. In turn, he asked about her life, her friends, her school, her hobbies beyond music. Each answer was a precious gift, another piece of the puzzle that was his daughter. She was serious about her studies, but had a wry sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments. She loved fantasy novels and documentary film. She was a vegetarian for ethical reasons, but admitted to occasionally craving hamburgers. She had her mother's artistic sensibility and his analytical mind, a combination that seemed to serve her well in both music and academics. Throughout their conversation, Alexander was acutely aware of time passing, of the sun shifting position in the sky, of other visitors coming and going from the garden. He wanted to freeze this moment, to extend it indefinitely, afraid that once it ended, the connection they were cautiously building might somehow dissolve. "We should probably wrap up for today," Sophia said eventually, checking her watch. "You have homework to finish before tomorrow, Lily." Alexander felt a stab of disappointment even as he recognized the wisdom of ending this first meeting while it was still going well, before fatigue or overwhelm could set in. Of course, he agreed, rising from the bench. "Thank you for coming today, Lily. It means more to me than I can express." Lily stood as well, studying him with those penetrating blue eyes. "Can we do this again?" she asked, the question catching him by surprise with its forthrightness. "As often as you'd like," he promised immediately. "Whenever works with your schedule. I have a cross-country meet on Wednesday afternoon," she said, "at Parkview High School, if you wanted to come." The invitation, casual as it was, felt monumental, the first step toward building a real relationship, initiated by Lily herself. Alexander felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. "I'd be honored," he managed finally. "What time?" 3:30, Lily replied. "I'm not the fastest on the team, but I'm not the slowest either." "I'll be there," Alexander promised. He hesitated, then asked, "Is it okay if I hug you goodbye? Or is that too much for today?" The question seemed to surprise Lily, who glanced at her mother before answering. "I think that, maybe not today if that's okay. I'm still sort of processing everything." "Of course," Alexander said quickly, hiding his disappointment beneath understanding. "Whatever you're comfortable with. Maybe next time," Lily offered, a small concession that nevertheless filled him with hope. "Next time," he agreed, smiling. As he watched Sophia and Lily walk away, their heads bent together in quiet conversation, Alexander felt a curious mixture of emotions: joy at having finally met his daughter, regret for the years lost, hope for the future they might build together, and a new sense of purpose that made his previous ambitions seem hollow by comparison. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Mitchell again, undoubtedly with updates on the board's reaction to his announcement. Alexander silenced it without checking the message. Whatever corporate drama was unfolding could wait. Today, for the first time in his adult life, something more important had claimed his attention. His daughter, Lily, a miracle he hadn't known to hope for. Now the center of a universe that had suddenly, irrevocably expanded beyond the narrow confines of boardrooms and balance sheets. 3 months later, Alexander sat at his usual table at the Verdant, reviewing quarterly reports while waiting for his lunch companion. The restaurant had become a different place for him, no longer just a convenient location for business meetings, but the site where his life had irrevocably changed when Sophia had whispered those simple words, "My mother has a ring just like yours." No. That wasn't right. It had been something about her mother having the same ring. The exact words had faded, but their impact remained crystal clear. "Mayor Blackwood," the mater d' approached his table. "Your guest has arrived." Alexander looked up to see Lily navigating through the tables toward him, her school backpack slung over one shoulder, wearing the maroon and gold scarf of her cross-country team despite the unseasonably warm December afternoon. Their weekly lunch dates had become a fixture in both their schedules, a standing appointment that Alexander protected with a ferocity that had once been reserved for board. "Sorry I'm late," Lily said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Physics lab ran over." "You're exactly on time," Alexander replied, checking his watch with a smile. "It's the lab." "Awesome. We were measuring the resonant frequencies of different materials." Her eyes lit up with the same enthusiasm she showed for cello. "Did you know you can identify the composition of an object just by the sound it makes when struck?" "I did not," Alexander admitted, delighted as always by her passionate curiosity. "Tell me more." As Lily launched into an explanation of wave patterns and molecular structures, Alexander marveled at how quickly she had become the center of his world. 3 months wasn't long in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like both an eternity and an instant, time simultaneously stretching and compressing as their relationship developed. Their server approached, not Sophia today, as she only worked weekends now, focusing on her teaching and her ongoing recovery. The latest scans had been promising, her oncologist increasingly confident about her long-term prognosis. "The usual, Miss Lily?" David asked with a smile. Lily had quickly become a favorite among the staff, her combination of intelligence and genuine warmth winning them over as easily as it had won over Alexander. "Yes, please. And can I get extra pickles today?" "Of course, and for you, Mr. Black." "I'll try the special," Alexander said, handing back the menu. "And coffee." "Black." After David left, Lily reached into her backpack and pulled out a thick envelope. "I got the information about that summer music program at Eastman," she said, sliding it across the table. "The application is due February 1st. Alexander opened the envelope, scanning the materials with the same attention he would give a major contract. "It looks excellent. Is this the one you're leaning toward?" "I think so," single quotes. Lily fidgeted with her water glass. "But it's expensive." "That's not a concern," Alexander assured her automatically. "Mom says I should apply for the scholarships anyway," Lily countered. "She doesn't want me to think money solves everything." Alexander nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in Sophia's approach. His instinct was still to sweep in with financial solutions, to use the resources at his disposal to smooth his daughter's path. Sophia provided a necessary counterbalance, reminding both of them that character was built through effort, not convenience. "Your mother's right," he conceded. "Apply for the scholarships. If you don't receive them, we'll discuss other options." Lily's smile was approving. "That's what Mom said you'd say." "Did she now?" Alexander raised an eyebrow, amused by the idea of Sophia predicting his responses. "And what else does your mother say about me?" "That you're learning," Lily replied with the blunt honesty that continued to catch him off guard. And that I should be patient with you because fatherhood is new territory. Alexander laughed, the sound still unfamiliar but increasingly natural. She's right about that too. Their food arrived, and the conversation shifted to Lily's upcoming cello recital, a solo performance at a local arts center, more prestigious than the community center events. Alexander had already arranged to clear his calendar that day, prioritizing his daughter's milestone over the quarterly board meeting despite Mitchell's continued protests. "How's the company doing?" Lily asked, as if reading his thoughts. "Mom said you stepped back from being the CEO, executive chairman now," Alexander confirmed. "The transition has been educational." That was an understatement. The board's initial resistance had been fierce, the stock price temporarily dropping as shareholders reacted to the unexpected leadership change. But Janet Stein had proven herself more than capable, bringing a collaborative approach that complemented Alexander's more directive style. The company was stabilizing, adapting, perhaps even thriving in ways it couldn't have under his singular control. "Do you miss it?" Lily asked, her perceptiveness again revealing how much of himself he saw in her. Being in charge of everything? Alexander considered the question carefully, wanting to give his daughter the honesty she deserved. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when I hear about decisions being made differently than I would make them, but then I remember what I gained in exchange." "What's that?" Lily asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. "You," Alexander said simply. "Time with the chance to be your father. Not just biologically, but in reality." Lily ducked her head slightly, still unused to such direct expressions of affection, but her pleased smile told him she appreciated the sentiment. Their relationship was evolving gradually, building on small moments rather than grand gestures. Watching her compete in cross-country meets, helping with calculus homework, attending her performances, simply being present in ways that mattered. "Mom says you're coming for Christmas dinner," Lily said, changing the subject. "With Grandma Eleanor too, if that's all right with you," Alexander replied, careful as always to respect her boundaries. The invitation had come from Sophia, but he would decline immediately if Lily wasn't comfortable. "It's good," she assured him. "Grandma's excited. Keeps talking about how she always liked you even after the divorce." Alexander smiled, remembering Eleanor's straightforward kindness, so similar to her granddaughters. "I always liked her too. And you and Mom seem okay now," Lily observed, watching him with that penetrating gaze. "Not fighting or anything. We're not finding our way," Alexander said carefully. His relationship with Sophia had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Not a romantic reconciliation, but not merely co-parents either. There was a tentative friendship forming, built on shared concern for Lily and a mutual acknowledgement of past mistakes. Their lunches concluded. Alexander walked Lily out to the car that would take her back to school. These midday breaks in her schedule had been arranged with her principal's approval, recognized as important for a teenager adjusting to the sudden appearance of her father in her life. "See you Saturday at the recital," Lily said, giving him the quick, slightly awkward hug that had become their standard farewell. The physical affection had been hard-won, initiated by her only after several weeks of building trust. "I'll be there," Alexander promised. Front row. He watched as the car pulled away, carrying his daughter back to her school life, a world largely separate from him, filled with friends and teachers and experiences he was only beginning to understand. The urge to protect her, to control her environment and eliminate all potential difficulties, remained strong, but he was learning, slowly, to balance that instinct with respect for her independence. Rather than returning to the office, Alexander found himself walking toward the community center where Sophia would be teaching her afternoon class. They hadn't planned to meet today, but he felt a sudden need to see her, to share the simple joy of their daughter's company. The center was quiet when he arrived, most classes still an hour from starting. He found Sophia in her studio, preparing materials for her adult beginners watercolor class. She looked up when he entered, surprise quickly replaced by a knowing smile. "Lunch with Lily?" she asked, setting down the brushes she'd been organizing. "Yes," Alexander confirmed, leaning against the doorframe. "She told me about the summer program at Eastman and the scholarship applications. Single quotes. Sophia nodded. "I hope you agreed with my approach." "I did," he assured her, though my first instinct was still to write a check. "Of course it was," Sophia said, but her tone was teasing rather than critical. "You're getting better at resisting that instinct, though." Alexander moved into the studio, helping her arrange the easels without being asked. They had fallen into this comfortable pattern of cooperation, their shared focus on Lily's well-being, creating a foundation for a new kind of relationship, one that acknowledged their history without being defined by it. "She seems happy," he observed, "balanced." "She is," Sophia agreed, "having you in her life. It's been good for her, Alexander. Better than I expected, to be honest." The admission clearly cost her something, an acknowledgement that her decision 15 years ago, however well-intentioned, had deprived Lily of a relationship that might have been valuable all along. "Thank you," Alexander said quietly, "for finding me, for giving me this chance." Sophia looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I didn't do it for you," she reminded him gently. "I did it for her. And for myself, to be honest. I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to me and her never knowing you." "I know," Alexander acknowledged, "but I'm grateful nonetheless." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, arranging the studio for the afternoon class. It struck Alexander how completely his life had transformed in just 3 months. from solitary focus on corporate domination to this unexpected family configuration with his ex-wife and newly discovered daughter at its center. "Will you come for coffee after the recital on Saturday?" Sophia asked suddenly. "Eleanor wants to make dinner, but I told her that might be too much." Coffee seemed like a reasonable compromise. The invitation represented another small step in their evolving dynamic, another careful expansion of the boundaries they were all negotiating. "I'd like that," Alexander said simply. As he turned to leave, Sophia called his name, stopping him at the door. When he looked back, she was smiling, that genuine, warm smile he'd first noticed at the Verdant when she thought he wasn't watching. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "I think you're becoming the man I always hoped you could be." The words caught him off guard, a validation he hadn't known he was seeking. Before he could respond, her expression shifted to something more playful. "Don't let it go to your head, though. You still have a lot to learn about being a father to a teenage girl." Alexander laughed, accepting both the compliment and the qualification with equal grace. "I'm counting on you to help me figure it out." "Always," she promised, the word carrying echoes of their past and possibilities for their future. As he left the community center, Alexander's phone buzzed with messages from Mitchell, from Janet Stein, from board members anxious about the upcoming quarterly report. Once these would have been his highest priority, demanding immediate attention regardless of personal cost. Now they could wait. His meeting with the investment team wasn't until tomorrow. His presentation to the board was prepared. The company was stable under Janet's leadership. Instead of returning to his office, Alexander walked to the nearby park, finding a bench in the winter sunshine. He took out his phone and opened the photo gallery that had become his most treasured possession, images of Lily at her cross-country meets, at her recitals, studying at his dining table, laughing with Eleanor at Sunday breakfasts. His daughter, the miracle he hadn't known existed 3 months ago, now the center of a life that finally felt complete in ways success and wealth had never achieved. In the distance, the city skyline rose against the December sky, buildings bearing his company's name, monuments to what he had once believed was his only legacy. He still took pride in what he had built, still found satisfaction in business well conducted, but sitting in the park on a Wednesday afternoon looking at photographs of his daughter while deliberately ignoring urgent business messages, Alexander Blackwood finally understood what true wealth looked like. Not the numbers in his bank accounts or the properties in his portfolio, but the second chance he'd been given when his ex-wife had approached his table at the Verdant and whispered a simple observation that had changed everything.